Okay, in the last lesson on ape genius, we learned about some of the mental differences between humans and chimps. Humans, they can share attention, they can use language, and they can teach each other, and that helps us understand why humans have very advanced culture and chimps have rudimentary, simple cultural traditions. In this lesson, we'll take a look at the evolutionary story to help us understand how those differences might have arisen. And we'll start the story with the common ancestor. Now remember, Darwin argues that chimps and humans had a common ancestor in the past. DNA analysis suggests that that common ancestor lived about 6 million years ago. We'll study the DNA techniques a little later in the course. So here we are, 6 million years ago. This ape ancestor was well adapted to forest living. Right? So Africa at the time was covered with forests, and we know that primates do well up in the trees. They get food in the trees, and they also have some measure of safety in the trees from dangerous predators on the ground. But something apparently happened, right? So this common ancestor, this ape ancestor, some of those individuals went on to change into modern-day chimps, but they still live in the forests, right? But of course, humans live all over the place, and something happened to some members of the common ancestor species that didn't happen to others. One of the big changes in our lineage was the evolution of bipedalism. That's walking on two limbs there. Now this will be our icon for the chimp. See long forearms here, good for swinging around the trees and so on. Very powerful frame, body, excellent climbers the chimps are, and so presumably was this common ancestor ape. But something happened here, a change in anatomy leading to bipedalism. And researchers who study bipedalism argue that it's a very efficient form of locomotion, about 4 times more efficient. So that would be useful if you have to walk long distances. Well, why would you have to walk long distances? Scientists argue that what was happening in the past was that the climate of Africa was getting more dry, and with less water, you cannot support as many trees in the area. So as the forests began to recede, you had more open grassland between bunches of trees. Well, if you get your food from the trees, you're going to have to now be walking longer and longer distances to get your food. Well, that's going to set up a situation where a more efficient travel mechanism will be favored. And so scientists argue that this ecological change, this environmental change, the forest receding, was instrumental in leading to a new adaptation, bipedalism. Now we'll be giving more detail about exactly how that change might have happened as we study Darwin and how Darwin understands this process of the evolution of adaptations. But for now, we're just going to notice the correlation, that as the environment changed, so did the characteristics of these organisms, our ancestors. Now, from the time of Lucy, this let's let this individual right here be Lucy. So we're about 3 million years ago from modern humans. Remember, the common ancestor was about 6 million years ago. So Lucy was bipedal, but interestingly, she still had a small brain, about the size of today's chimp, which was thought to be about the size of the common ancestor. So even while this change in anatomy in the skeleton, in the pelvis and the knee and the foot, even while that was happening, not much seemed to be happening in the brain department. So Lucy had a small brain, right? And apparently there were many successful examples of Lucy-type creatures living at this time. For millions of years, these bipedal ancestors did well, but they had small brains. But at a certain point after Lucy, we see an explosion in brain size, and that's correlated, of course, then with these cultural advancements as well. The making of tools, first simple, but then more complex, and then things like art and so on, and complex societies, and governments and so on, agriculture, etc. So major cultural innovations, rapid cultural change correlated to some increases in brain size here. But in the early history of the human line here, brains stayed small, yet an important change happened in terms of locomotion, bipedalism, and that's correlated to the opening up of the grasslands in the African environment. So again, we have this part of the story here is one of the evolution of some of these important mental characteristics in addition to physical characteristics. Along with bipedalism, as brains were changing over time, we get shared attention, language, teaching, and the cultural explosion. And again, the idea is that was all triggered by this environmental change. Some of the common ancestors were forced to live in the open grasslands, but the ones who stayed in the forest, see, they didn't undergo the same type of evolutionary change as the human lineage here. So let's use this example to make some connections with things we learned in the Paley-Hume section. First of all, point number one, with species, there's evidence of species changing. The fossil record is providing evidence of species change, right? Now that, of course, would mean that species don't have an essence. Remember, Paley argued that species had an essence. The essence was like the blueprint in the mind of God. Well, the fossil record seems to indicate that in our very own human history, in our recent human history, we have evidence of species change. From a common ape-like ancestor into a bipedal ancestor into an ancestor with larger and larger brains and more sophisticated culture. Point number two, if point number one is true, that species change, then there should be transitional species, right? So here we have Lucy here, and what a transitional species means is that this species here would show traits, similarities to the future species and some traits characteristic of the ancestral species, right? So we can kind of capture some kind of transition happening in time. So for example, Lucy is bipedal, like modern humans. So that's a characteristic of the later species, us, but it has a brain like an ape, right? So that's a characteristic of the common ancestor, small brain. Remember, the chimps maintained their small brains. So Lucy is a sort of a mix of different types of traits, and so we'll call that type of organism transitional. Now, Lucy, if we ask Lucy, hey, do you mind being called transitional? You know, Lucy's going to say, no, I'm not transitional. I am the end of evolution, right? But that's if we were asking Lucy in her time. We can only identify transitional species because we know what came later. I mean, we can then sort of compare it to the ancestral type. So point number two, we should evolutionary theory predicts, Darwin's view of things predicts that there should be transitional species. And as it happens in our own case, there is good evidence of transitional organisms. Point number three, nature experiments through reproduction. So again, this change from the knuckle walking, right, four-limbed walking to bipedalism required a different skeleton. The pelvis changed, the knee, the foot. These are differences in the way the skeleton is arranged and organized. And now how did that happen? How do you go from, you know, the chimp pelvis to the Lucy-like pelvis? Well, that's back to David Hume's idea of nature experimenting. Now Darwin's going to call this idea a variation, that when animals reproduce, their offspring often show variations, differences from each other and from their parents. And Darwin didn't know about DNA, but we will see that the explanation for these experiments, the variation in populations, has to do with differences in DNA. But nevertheless, we can use Hume's idea of nature experimenting. So you can go from a species that walks like this to descendants that walk like that. Nature experiments. Another example of experimentation would be the experimentation in brain size. Going from a Lucy-type creature with small brains, similar to the common ancestor, to modern humans, that transition was one of massive increase in the brain. And so here again, nature was experimenting with brain size. Over here, we didn't see this increase in brain size. While there might be some experimenting going on, we're gonna learn why it might be that experimenting leads to something in one evolutionary pathway, but experimenting might not lead to the same thing in a different pathway. And we'll, as we study evolutionary theory, we'll try to get a handle on that. Now, why the big brain expansion at this time after Lucy, right? Because Lucy had small brain like the common ancestor. What was going on here in the movie Becoming Human? Researchers now are interested in a recent discovery that the regions in Africa where these ancestors were found was undergoing rapid climate change. And when the climate is changing rapidly, that may pose challenges to the species living in the environment. A big brain would be very handy if that big brain came with intelligence and ways of cooperating and technology and language and so on. The big-brained species would be better able to deal with rapid environmental change in this period. And so this is one hypothesis as to what was the trigger for the big brain increase. So one final point about that. Notice, though, both the transition from knuckle walking to bipedalism, that was correlated to an environmental change as well. The forest was receding, the climate was drying out, and the grasslands opening up. And so that's correlated to this change, the change from knuckle to bipedal. But for the change in brain size, that seems to be correlated to a different environmental scenario. Not just the environment changing in some one direction, like just getting drier or just getting wetter, but rather rapid changes, going from dry to wet to dry to wet. And those rapid changes in the span of generations or hundreds of years or a couple hundreds of years, that quick change from dry to wet to dry to wet may have put pressures on the species living at the time to be able to solve the problems of living or die out. And big brains then would be favored under those conditions. And so notice different types of environmental change are correlated to different types of change in the species, anatomy, etc. So here are all those 3 points wrapped up. Species change, no essence then. So Darwin's going to argue there's no essence. Darwin would predict there's going to be transitional organisms, and we find evidence of transitional organisms. And third, how do we understand some of these changes going on here? We can borrow from David Hume's idea that nature experiments through reproduction.